Hello, welcome to CashcroftTV. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Thanks for watching another video on history of leaders of thought. Today we will be doing Anaximenes from ancient Greece and Sun Tzu from ancient China, or Sun Zi as it is in Chinese, meaning master sun. So without further ado, let's start off with Anaximenes. So I apologize if you're watching this video series in order. I have not adhered to a chronological timeline, at least in terms of Western philosophers. I did Pythagoras and Xenophanes prior to doing Anaximenes. I don't know, I thought it would just be nice to change things up, but this individual is, I would say, the third Western philosopher. So within the Milesian school, which was in ancient Ionia, there was firstly Thales, who was covered in the first video, and then Anaximander, who I covered in the second video, and then Anaximenes, who I'm covering now. So Anaximander was Thales' student, Anaximenes was Anaximander's student. So sort of similar to the Socrates, Plato, Aristotle sort of timeline, but this is all pre-Socratic philosophers. So I guess with that covered up, to start off with his main influence in terms of both philosophy and I would go so far as to say physics and science. He was what's called a material monoist. So similar to his teacher and his teacher's teacher, he believed in that all things came from one source. So in his teacher's case, that being Thales believed that everything came from water, everything was made of water. So for example, Earth is just an expression of water in a different density. As for Anaximander, Anaximenes' teacher, he believed that everything came from what's called apeiron, which is kind of an abstract term. Apeiron is like infinity. So we believe that everything came from this sort of infinity, and from there things go into a sort of binary. So there's the infinity, and then things go into like hot. Then he saw the duality of hot and cold, wet and dry. So from there things divided up. So one of the great things about this Milesian school is they were allowed to criticize and build upon their masters. So Anaximenes built upon both his two teachers, or his teacher and his teacher's teacher, and he came up with a third, or his own theory, in that everything came from air. So he coined this term pneuma, which means breath of life. So everything comes from air. So from a first principle standpoint, I think how he discovered this was he saw that if he were to breathe like on a hand with the mouth open, it would create perspiration, and he saw that as creating something out of air. Whereas if he closed his lips, cold air would come out, and he thought of that as the opposite, which is like taking away from creating matter. So I guess the best way to describe it is there's what, like, he believed in duality. So air is divided into either condensation or refraction. So condensation would be the accumulation of matter, and rarefaction is essentially like evaporation, the spreading of matter. And this is, I think, actually somewhat accurate. For example, I think it in terms of like from a nuclear physics standpoint, all matter, for example, you can fuse atoms together and you can create you can actually change the molecular structure of atoms. So from that standpoint, everything can be combined and everything can be broken down. So he saw that basically what he observed was there was the sky, and then sky would condense into clouds. The clouds would condense into rain, and the rain would fall upon the earth. And he saw the land that the people would observe would have just been very old air. So after a long enough time, long enough condensation, it created the earth landmass as we know it. To kind of further describe the world he believed we lived in, he saw that the Earth was like a sort of a flat. Obviously, he believed in a flat Earth because this was well, yeah, how could he possibly fathom a round Earth, having never been able to even travel to the New World? But he believed the Earth was flat and sort of floating like a leaf in the universe. He saw that and it's considered he was one of the first individuals to see a difference between the planets, which rotated the Earth, and the stars, which had their fixed location in the sky every the planets don't rotate the Earth, the planets rotate the sun, but they would have variable locations in the sky, whereas the stars would have constant locations. So he was one of the first to notice the difference between planets and stars. So what he saw the stars were, he thought the stars were like nails in an outer casing of the universe. So there's this outer casing of the universe, and there's the Earth floating around it like a sort of leaf, which is an accumulation of air. And at some point, as I mentioned, it's called rarefaction, which is essentially the like evaporation or the splitting or division. The Earth had these sort of discharges, and fire was considered like the rarefaction of air. So beyond air, it turns to fire. So these stars were like shot off particles from the Earth. Interestingly enough, though, he thought the sun, because he noticed that it moved around, was not like these particles. He thought that it was very much like the Earth and the moon in that it was made from the condensation of air. So he saw it as a physical body as opposed to balls of fire. But the only difference is he thought that the sun was spinning so fast that it had an outer casing of fire. So that was sort of the world that he observed in terms of, he saw on top of this leaf, that being the Earth that was floating around, there would be a dome over it, and the day and the night would just be the stars all moving north. I don't know why he observed it being north, but I don't know. Take it as you will, but that's what he saw. So these stars across the dome would just move across the sky each night and then sort of return and come back. So yeah, that's kind of how he saw it. And I think here's a quote. So, just as our soul, being air, holds us together, so pneuma and air encompasses and guard the whole world. So he saw that even there's pretty much two types of, well, I think it's hard to interpret this. He either thinks that the soul is came from air, so it's a type of condensation, or there are two types of air. There's the air that creates like the earth and water and pretty much all matter, and then there's the air, which he believes the soul, there's a special air in you somewhere that holds you together and condensates and creates your soul. So he was one of the first to sort of hypothesize that the soul was something that was created. It's said that there's also like a lot of parallels in his thinking to the Old Testament, in that in the way he perceived the earth being created by this soul-like force, or like some kind of creator, but he did not believe that of any instructory nature. So he didn't believe that there was any divine rule or anything like that. But I think, so to kind of expand on his where he sort of got wrong was in that theory where he thought that hot air was associated, because he breathed on his hand with you can try this as well. If you breathe with an open mouth, hot air comes out and you get condensation. And if you breathe cold air, if you close your lips, you get cold air. So he thought that hotness was associated with the accumulation or condensation, and coldness was associated with rarefaction or evaporation. So this is actually close, but it's actually the absolute opposite. So today we know, based on the kinetic molecular theory, that hotness is associated with evaporation or rarefaction, the separation of particles, whereas coldness is actually associated with condensation or the accumulation of particles. But still, unlike his contemporaries, he actually based it on a first principle. Here is something he truly observed, and this is the conclusion he got. And it would have been nice if he was actually right, but it just happens to be the opposite. But this, later, Aristotle obviously quotes much of what we know about Anaximenes was based on Aristotle's writing, but Aristotle was also heavily influenced by Plato, and it said that, well, Plato believed in the seven elements, I suppose, that being fire, air, wind, clouds, earth, and stone. And they're all just different densities of a single thing. So this is obviously very closely based on what Anaximenes thought. So there's the air, and pretty much everything in the spectrum is based on this one concept. So it said that Plato probably derived this conclusion from Anaximenes. And I think Anaximenes is actually very much right in this regards. I do think that all matter comes from the same thing, that being atoms, electrons, and neutrons, and that's what we see in nuclear physics, right? So, for example, you can combine atoms through nuclear fusion and create bigger atoms all the way up to anything, uranium, whatever, and so I think he's right there. I think he thought that the basis was air, and that was probably just because that was the closest or most simple atom he could fathom, whereas air is predominantly oxygen and CO2. He was very close, but I suppose if he hypothesized, if he had changed his theory and said that everything came from hydrogen, which is the smallest atom, or even, if everything came from hydrogen, because I think it would have to be a cohesive unit. It couldn't just be everything comes from a neutron, for example, because everything doesn't come from a neutron. You also need a proton and an electron. But if he had changed his theory and said everything came from hydrogen, and if he had revised it saying that heat rarefacts things and cold condenses things, I think this would have been, and obviously not to discredit his current theory, this would have been, it would have never needed to be revised for over 2,000 years. When Newton came across his discoveries, that was 2,000 years later, and he pretty much came up with the same thing except for the opposites in terms of temperatures and very impressive in this. And I would say what he is known for, physics, almost trumps anything he does in terms of philosophy, but he's still considered a philosopher for the way he approached learning, a sort of love of wisdom. And I suppose that's about it for him. I'll get back to him in the comparison. I hope I don't miss anything, because I really... I guess one last thing. So similar to Anaximander, so the reason why, and I've said this in the previous videos, I didn't include Hesiod or Homer in these is because they were obviously, I think, I would consider them philosophers in a sense. They led through analogy. They led through stories, just like Shakespeare, or obviously hugely influential on the modern world, but he didn't break it down into a first principles or a sort of a science or an instructory way. He led through analogy. So going back to that, whereas most people thought that earthquakes were, the gods, the pantheon of gods, wreaking havoc on the world, he thought of it from a scientific standpoint and actually managed to cohesively combine it with his theories relating to air. So, for example, he thought that earthquakes were the result of too much rarefaction, too much dryness in the in the Earth's crust, and he thought that, or potentially as well, like he believed both of these, there could have been too much water, too much liquid, causing it to crack. So this is I think, pretty profound because, people were not able to prove the tectonic plates for thousands of years later, but he was hypothesizing that deep below the Earth there were these big moving plates, and this is something that he could only conclude based on an extreme abstraction, probably hundreds of hours of hypothesizing. And he happened to be, I would say, obviously, it's not really the result of air rarefacting or condensing, but he was right in it being these big plates cracking and moving together, so I think that's pretty profound. Additionally, lightning, he thought, was the rarefaction or the separation of clouds quickly. So once again, combining a natural phenomenon into his theory rather than saying it's Zeus throwing lightning bolts down at Earth, which is, I don't know, I think we can safely say false. And in terms of rainbows, he thought that rainbows were the result of condensed air getting hit by light. So, and once again, I don't think that's entirely wrong. For example, rainbows are the result of water vapor getting refracted by light. So, and in a sense, if you think about it from a nuclear physics standpoint, water really is a more dense molecule than air. So, it's in some ways correct. So, yeah, I think absolutely phenomenal discoveries from this individual, and he's considered the third and last of the three great Milesian philosophers, or the first three great Western philosophers. So that's Anaximenes. I'll talk about him a bit more in the comparison, but there won't be too long of a comparison because these two actually happen to be quite different and quite unrelated, but regardless. So Sun Tzu, or Sun Zi as it is in Chinese, similar to our previous individual Confucius, is Kong Zi, which means Master Kong. This is Sun Zi, meaning Master Sun. So he was actually born Sun Wu, if you care to know his original name, and he was either born in Qi or Wu under the Zhou dynasty. He eventually at 512 BC, so when he was 32 years old, he starts working for King Heilu of Wu. So this might be why people believe he was from Wu. Maybe he was from Qi and then moved to Wu and then worked for King Heilu of Wu. Who knows? But it's besides the point. So, and he achieved great amount of success there, and ultimately ended up writing this book known as The Art of War, which this book, I remember when I first I love this book. I thought it was almost like a chicken soup for the soul. This book and Machiavelli's The Prince. I loved these two books when I was younger, and I will cover Machiavelli later too. I thought these, I just absolutely loved these two books. But so I guess a cool anecdote, because not much is known about his life. Most of what we know about his thoughts and beliefs were based on the book, but he had this test. So, and this is written about by Sima Qian, who's a very famous Chinese historian. So he comes into the palace, and to test him, he is given 360 concubines to turn into soldiers. So concubines are obviously very difficult to train and to address. So what he does first is he divides the 360 concubines into two groups. So 180. Yeah, that's correct. So he divides them into two groups, and then he asks the king to pick his favorite individual from each group to be their leader. And he does so, and he tells the group, turn right. And they all, they're giggling and they don't do anything. He says, turn right again, and they don't do it. So he says to the king, we are going to kill the two captains. And the king's pretty much astounded. He says, these are my two favorites. These are the two best among them. Why would you kill the two best among them? But ultimately he consents, and he proves that he's right. So I think there's two key takeaways from this. Firstly, it's that in terms of leadership, if it is the responsibility of the generals to get the other concubines to work. So they were not fulfilling their duties. They might have been the best soldiers, the most fit, but the job of any subordinate is to get the further subordinates to do their job. So firstly, they weren't doing their job, but also it's got a component of equality in that just because they were the best doesn't mean they couldn't be easily replaced. So once he killed these two best individuals, the two groups, now down to 179 each, instantly started working. He said turn right, they turned right away, because they feared that as the new leaders, they feared that if they didn't do their job, they would be killed off like the previous one. So obviously kind of a cruel way of doing it, but I think sort of a profound demonstration, and that obviously won the king's favor and gave him a great amount of success. So there's not really much proof of any of his actual victories. So there's probably proof of his influence in the Battle of Beju, or Boju, but a lot of skeptics think that his name is questionable. Sun could mean fugitive, and Wu meaning valiant hero. So he could just be like an archetype for a fugitive hero, someone who rises from nothing. And some of the things he writes about, such as crossbows and such, wouldn't have been available for him to write about. But I think, to be honest, shame on the skeptics. Like, what good do we do in questioning his existence? I think if he did exist, well, we should definitely accept that he lived and appreciate that he lived and celebrate that he lived. But if he didn't, I think it's just as great in that we can it's something to admire, someone to look up to, and someone to learn from. So I think shame on the skeptics. I think they have no place here, and I even regret that I mentioned some of their arguments, because I think they have no purpose but creating evil or creating hate. So they're just haters. So I believe Sun Tzu is real, maybe even isn't, but I'll tell everyone he's real, and I'll believe that he's real. So I guess similar to most of the Eastern philosophers, the best way to really to learn about them is to sort of address some of their writings. So unlike Anaximenes, where we couldn't do this because none of his writings exist, we can actually do this with Sun Tzu. So let's go through some of these. So I'll go through first some of these ones on the page. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy with fighting is probably his most famous quote. Very simple. There's not really any big takeaways, but I guess this is, some say the art of war is a reflection of Taoism in a sort of more applicable way, and with respect to government, politics, and warfare. So Taoism, if you haven't watched a previous video, was largely furthered by Lao Tzu, who was probably I would consider the first Eastern philosopher, and he believed in this thing called Wu Wei, which directly translates, I believe, to action without action. But I think what is meant by this is action without intention. So Taoism is sort of like feeling at one with the world, and it's sort of like I think you could draw a parallel to Anaximenes, whereas Anaximenes believed that there was this air, which is the source of everything. Taoism believes there's something fluid combining everything, sort of like an art, and that's why it's called, I think, for that reason, art of war, and it makes particular sense in this regard. So a lot of the things he addresses are more associated with peace. He advocates for delay in terms of warfare. He advocates for spies, alliances, and even submission when necessary. So I guess to further go into the quotes, some of these I'll just go through quick because there isn't too much explanation. But plan for what is difficult while it is easy. Do what is great while it is small. So this is just sort of be proactive, but also micromanage. Let your plans be dark and impenetrable as night, and when you move, fall like a thunderbolt. So I kind of think of this as sort of like the Muhammad Ali quote, move like a butterfly, sting like a bee. So be light, be quick, and hit hard. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. So basically, this is saying that obviously I think everyone would agree that it's important to, or everyone at the time would have agreed, and everyone today obviously believes, that you must know your enemy to succeed. But this is most importantly that you must know yourself. So the second line is, I think, the most important. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. So, yeah, that's a good one there as well. Never interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake. I think that's simple as well. There are not more than 5 musical notes, yet the combination of these 5 give rise to melodies that can never be heard. So this is really about the sort of, I think, going back to the anecdote with the concubines. It was that the individual is not as important as the collective whole, and it sort of has a compounding or accumulation effect. 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. 1 + 1 equals 3 or 4. Obviously not true, but it's the concept of synergies, I suppose, and to take a finance term in that regards. So that's sort of what he's getting at there. I wrote down a few others of my personal favorites. It is the rule in war: if 10 times the enemy's strength, surround them. If 5 times, attack them. If double, be able to divide them. If equal, engage them. If fewer, be able to evade them. So this is just a sort of a really practical way of approaching warfare. If you have twice the size of the army, aim to divide them. So this is very instructive, and which I think is very useful. But also, most importantly, and it really underlines his philosophy and how he differed from a lot of his contemporaries. So a lot of people would thought there's a lot of glory in losing, but he advocates that if you have fewer soldiers, just evade them, just don't fight. There's no glory in death, but perhaps there is, depending on the reason. But further, the skillful tactician may be likened to a shui jan. Now, the shui jan is a snake that is found in Chang'an Mountains. Strike at its head, and you will be attacked by its tail. Attack its tail, and you will be attacked by its head. Strike at its middle, and you will be attacked by both its head and tail. So, I think what this means is that, for example, like a snake, you could think of it as like a part of an army, or like a troop. If you attack the head, which is obviously probably not the most advisable because it's the most dangerous part, the tail is not as effective, but it will still strike you. But the interesting part is that the tail, which is probably seems more vulnerable, it has the defense of the head. So to attack the tail would probably be worse than attacking the head on. So this is probably advocating for the cohesion of the army. And then if you think about it, going for the center of the snake, you would think would be the safest way to go. But since there's the cohesion of the army, they will bring in both the tail and the head to support it. So it's, I think it's a cool idea, and I like the concept of the snake. Maybe I'll go on a rant on the significance of the snake throughout history and throughout anthropology in another time. So, and the last one I have here is, all warfare is based on deception. Hence, when we are able to attack, we must seem unable. When using our forces, we must appear inactive. When we are near, we must appear far away. When we are far away, we must make him believe we are near. So, pretty much to sum up everything, he believes in deception and appearing as the opposite. And the Taoism was derived originally from yin yang, and I think you could probably bring in a yin yang component to this. The duality of things always appear the opposite, I think, is a nice approach. So yeah, I guess in terms of comparison, and obviously there's not a lot, but I think they both believed that well, you could say that Sun Tzu was a Taoist, so he believed that there was a one sort of melody, or one sort of song, or one sort of art to the universe, something similar to what Anaximenes believed, in that there was the one source, that being air, of all of the universe. But besides that, they're really quite different. But I think they would have, another key similarity is that they approach things much more analytically than their contemporaries, and I think that's why they both would qualify on the list of great thinkers or leaders of thought, whereas most other Greeks would have been thinking about these abstract archetype gods flying up in the pantheon, throwing thunderbolts. He believed that there was this like earthquakes are the cause of this scientific phenomenon. So he based things off observation, breathing on the hand, open and closed mouth. Sun Tzu also believed in analytical ways of thinking. Don't engage if you're going to lose. Deceive your enemy at all costs. But yeah, and in terms of differences, comparison, contrast, there are many, and I don't even think I need to list them. But I think I think it's nice that I come out these two in the videos, because they really mesh well. Like, if there was an individual who managed to accomplish what both they did, would have been amazing. And I guess one thing that I mentioned in the Laozi Thales video was that much more of Laozi's writings, Tao Te Ching, lasted because he wrote it in an artful manner, whereas Anaximenes' writing haven't lasted. So